Hello watch enthusiasts. Now the day I release this video is Wednesday, and this is the day before Baselworld opens, and is in fact the press day. Now I will be covering Baselworld this year, and later on in the week of Baselworld I shall be releasing what I see as my favourite models in terms of sports and dress watches, in a very similar manner to the way I did SIHH this year. But before all of this, I would like to talk about the history of Baselworld, because of course this is the biggest watch show in the calendar, and certainly is something not to miss, if at all possible. Now it'll be my first year at the show, and I really am very excited to be there to cover it. But I would like to talk about this history, because I think it does have a very interesting history as it developed through the years. Of course, this story starts in 1917, so of course this is the centenary of the watch show. And it was originally called the Schweizer Mustermesse Basel, or the Swiss Design Fair in Basel. And this showcased really Swiss engineering and design, which did not include jewellery and watches as a key part, but rather included them as an aspect of Swiss manufacturing. And 831 companies were present that year, from everything from really transport, shipping, scientific companies, as well as production firms. So there really was everything there that year, and this was by no means a watch show. In terms of notable releases that year, the Cartier Tank was a major one, though of course it wasn't released in Switzerland or at Basel, but it certainly was something of an interesting watch, and has become quite an icon over the years. And I will be talking about a few of these icons during notable years at Baselworld. Now, throughout the 1920s, the show continued to grow, and its wristwatch following certainly did also thrive. Now during this period of time, various innovations were released, notably Fortis, having bought the patent in 1924, released the first production automatic watch, which was a great success and certainly an interesting release. But this did certainly point in the direction of the show becoming more of a watch-oriented area, specifically for Swiss wristwatches to show their potential. Now, 1931 was a great change for this show, as it was renamed the Swiss Watch Fair, or Schweizer Uhrenmesse. And of course this was a clear direction which one could have predicted in the mid-20s. This was going to become a watch-only sort of show. And really I would say this show at this point was instrumental in retaining interest in watches between the wars, as in fact various projects by the Swiss government themselves that were funded by the government aimed to retain interest in watches between the wars, where interest was waning. Now, Hall 1 was also released, or at least the building which was to become Hall 1 of the show. And if one looks at the map, this is the very largest building in which the more major brands show their watches today. And originally this was a sort of separate pavilion, but this certainly has grown into really the iconic part of Baselworld. In terms of releases this year, the really most interesting watch this year was the Jagga Reverso. And this is a remarkable watch designed for polo players, so they could reverse the case through the hinged mechanism of the watch within its mountings, to allow one to play vigorous sports such as polo without the concern of smashing the crystal and damaging the dial while playing. This also moved the crown to a position where it wasn't at the front of the wrist, but rather at the back of the wrist, allowing one to protect that too. And this really was an iconic timepiece, and still is to this day, a wonderful watch to own, and certainly an interesting piece. In 1932 there is another major addition to Baselworld, and that's the inclusion of Patek Philippe in the lineup of watches this year. And I must say that this being one of the most iconic brands in terms of Swiss wristwatches, it certainly is a year to note due to their first inclusion in this show. In 1934 we see several changes. Notably, Hall 5 is opened, which is a smaller hall that sits alongside Hall 1. Also, Hoya, the creator in the 50s of the Calibre 11, enter the show for the first time this year. In 1939 we see the inclusion of Rolex here for the first time. And this is interesting because of course the two innovations for which we know Rolex, the oyster case and the perpetual movement, were both released previously, the oyster case in 1925, and then the perpetual movement in the early 30s. So we certainly do see the fact that Rolex did miss their heyday, if you will, in terms of releases at Baselworld, but certainly did compensate with various watches released in the 50s and 60s through to the present day, which truly do show this these famous features of a Rolex watch. Now, the next really notable year comes in 1953, incidentally, the year of the Rolex Submariner's release. Of course, the original Submariner was very different to what we have today, a much smaller 37 or 38mm watch, depending on where it's measured from, with a very simple bezel, but this certainly was the start of something very interesting for dive watches. Though, of course, it was preceded by the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, it certainly is still an icon of the dive watch community. This year, Hall 2 was also opened, which is the large square building that sits alongside the long and slim Hall 1. And this has become an interesting and an iconic building for its particular design and form, and certainly is an interesting architectural piece, alongside the very much functional design of Hall 1. Again, in 1964, another hall was released. This was Hall 3, and was again another building in which to house the ever-growing popularity of the show. And of course, the show really was growing in popularity at this point. The number of brands included and the area each brand took up was growing extremely rapidly. This is demonstrated by the fact that, for example, at its inception, Rolex had quite a small area for their show and their watches, whereas by today they have actually 40 times the surface area of show flooring that they did originally, and that really is demonstrative of the amount of increase in size this watch show has gone through. Now, throughout the 1960s, there was a flurry of wristwatches which were very notable in their fields. Starting off, I think, with the 1966 Doxa Sub 300. And the Doxa Sub 300 has become a real icon in terms of dive watches. And not among people who don't know their dive watches, but rather among those who do. This was a watch which incorporated fantastic water resistance with a very modern approach to legibility on the dial, and a very different and really unimitated approach at the time. This also was the first watch to feature the two styles of bezel on the watch at once. So it had the depth gauge as well as the timing bezel, which was again a practical feature and an interesting one to see. Also, this watch is very typical of the time, and I think this is one of the few watches out there which hasn't really changed from its inception to today. Obviously, innovations have been added to the watch, but as a whole, the watch really has retained its no-nonsense professional aesthetic. Incidentally, this Doxa was the first watch to have an orange dial of this type. And previously, dive watches had black dials, sometimes even white dials, but never orange. And in this case, Doxa really did use this their advantage to make a watch which was extremely legible underwater. In addition to the Doxa, in 1967, the Rolex Sea Dweller was released. Of course, this is a fantastic watch, an iconic watch too, which revolutionised dive watches in a way which I don't think had been done before. Of course, the Sea Dweller became a real icon of dive watches with its helium escape valve, and again is another one of these incredible watches released by Rolex, which was so very focused on their purpose. Of course, the original Sea Dweller wasn't the one you see on the screen here. This is a double red, which is my personal favourite, but certainly the dive watches were still of an incredible technology, and I think went unrivaled until 1970 when the Omega Seamaster Ploprof was released. Again, another iconic watch which I've made a video on previously. One interesting detail about the Sea Dweller is the fact that originally this was a 500-metre diver, but Rolex promptly realised that this was actually capable of another 110 metres, taking it up to 610, and promptly changed the dials, hence why the original 500-metre models are so rare. In 1969, of course, several incredible things were released at Baselworld, and the two most important ones were the Zenith El Primero, the 36,000 vibrations per hour model, and this was officially the first automatic chronograph. And this did revolutionise watches, and as you can see from this diagram of the movement, the rotor is actually integrated into the movement itself and can't be seen over the top, but this was an automatic movement. And it certainly was an interesting watch, as it really did kick off this phase of what we would see as or perceive as a normal or very normal sort of complication on a watch. So this really was an incredible piece, and also running at that high rate of 36,000 vibrations per hour makes this movement all the more impressive. Now, momentarily after that movement was released, the Hoya Calibre 11 was released in conjunction with 4 brands. And this was a movement which was far more widely used than the movement in the Zenith, and was used in various brands' watches at Baselworld 1969, or at least the what was to become Baselworld 1969. So this was certainly a far more widespread movement, but didn't quite get released quick enough to beat the Zenith to that position of first automatic chronograph. Now, in 1972, several changes also came to the show format itself. Now, until this point, only Swiss brands had been able to participate, as this was very much a Swiss show. Whereas as of 1972, French, Italian, German and British companies were now allowed to partake in this show to showcase their new models. Also, this year, the AP Royal Oak was released, and really did cause quite a stir with its octagonal bezel and integrated bracelet, taking a very different approach to dress watches. Of course, this was also the most expensive steel watch ever released, with a price of around 3,900 Swiss francs at the time, coming into around £10,000 at the current point. But then that was an outrageous amount of money to spend on a purely steel watch, which clearly did show the way that AP were able to market this was quite remarkable, in conjunction with that incredible design from Gerald Genta. It's worth also noting that in 1973, due to the fact that this watch show now included the inclusion of foreign brands from the rest of Europe, it was renamed the European Watch and Jewellery Show to better demonstrate what this show was showcasing, rather than simply calling it a Swiss show. They now did include the other provenances in its name. Now, in 1983, we see the introduction of Breguet, one of my favourite brands, for their horologerie designs and productions at Baselworld for the first time. And this is certainly an interesting addition, and one which I think is truly worthy of a show of this type. This year was also the year of the release of the Swatch, which is of course one of the most famous Swiss watches ever created, really, and I think did single-handedly save the Swiss watch industry from the quartz crisis of this era, by which I mean the fact that Swiss watches couldn't keep up with the demand for cheaper, less expensive quartz watches. We also see one very major change to the naming of this show, which now is simply Basel and then the year. So in this case, it's Basel 83, and I think this cleaned up the name of the show and made it altogether more recognisable. Now, Basel 1986 was probably one of the biggest changes to the show, and here we have the change to the fact that now non-European brands can include themselves in the show. Notably, all the Japanese brands were now a major part of this international watch show. I would say this was a fantastic choice on the part of the organisers of Baselworld, on the basis that so many incredible watches are made in the rest of the world other than Switzerland and European countries. I think it would be really a crime to not include them in such a multicultural sort of show. Now, at Basel 1990, we have a really fantastic and very, very notable release from Patek Philippe. And this was the watch which held the title of being the most complicated watch for 26 years. And this was for the 150th anniversary of the famous brand, the Calibre 89, with 33 complications. This was an extremely large pocket watch, around 80mm in diameter and 40 or so thick, which is incidentally currently for sale, or at least going up for sale later on in the year. Of course, these watches were made in 4 versions originally. When I say 4 versions, I mean 4 examples: a platinum, a white gold, a rose gold, and a yellow gold. Now, when new, these watches sat around the $5 million mark for their price, but today are worth far, far more. Now, 1998 saw the release of one of what I think is the most impressive movement in terms of mechanical watches ever made. And this is the Seiko spring drive movement. And this is a movement whereby most of the movement is mechanical, but the actual direct drive to the hands is run through the fact that cogs with a magnetic field can in fact induce a current by running through a coil, and thereby power the hands to run completely smoothly without any oscillating. This makes these watches extremely accurate. Notably, some new ones have an accuracy of -5 + 5 seconds a day. 1999 was also a major year for Baselworld, and in this year the Hall number 1 was redesigned and modified to be far better for the show. Also, Omega used the Daniels coaxial escapement, a different style of escapement with three plates rather than 2 on normal escapements, which meant much less wear over the years and a much more accurate watch in the long run. And this has become really a norm in the Omega lineup these days. One other change this year was the fact that the watches from the Richemont group did in fact pull out of Baselworld and chose to go elsewhere, and this resulted in the formation of SIHH as a show designed specifically for this group. And that certainly did change the sort of politics and the way Baselworld was arranged. But certainly it does break things up, the fact that we have these watches released at SIHH and then Baselworld is a separate entity. 2003 was also a major year for Baselworld, as this was the year it was actually changed to Baselworld in terms of naming, which I think is a much better name than previous iterations, as it covers the fact that this is based in Switzerland, in Basel, but nonetheless incorporates engineering and technology from the world. Now, the Trade Fair Tower is also built this year, which was at the time the tallest building in Switzerland. I believe now it's the third, but certainly still an interesting building to see. 2003 also sees the introduction of Hall 6, an extra hall to further increase the area of the show and increase the number of products and watches that can be shown therein. Now, the penultimate interesting year I'd like to talk about is 2007, and this was a real milestone year for Baselworld, as it was the first year where more than 100,000 guests and visitors arrived. In fact, this was a record year of 101,700 who attended the show, and this really does show the popularity of this show in terms of the amount of viewings that one can have in 8 days. So this certainly was an incredible thing to witness, and did show that Baselworld was really evolving into the modern world. Now, 2013 was really one of the biggest years for Baselworld, as this included a really full redesign of the show, notably a fantastically decorated and adjusted, modern sort of architecture, which was introduced around and between Hall 1 and 3, and this broke up the design of the building entirely, and also resulted in the building of that sort of skylight, a tubular design over the pathway in the centre of Hallway 1, making really quite an incredible architectural structure, which I think really does capture the innovation and interesting technology seen within. This was also a year of great success, as these constructions had been going for 2 years and were finally complete, and really did result in the Baselworld building which we see today, which is quite an incredible place. Anyway, that concludes my history of this historic and interesting show, and I truly am delighted to say that I'll be there, when this video is released, to really cover the show and provide all the interesting content. Anyway, I'll conclude the video there, but thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel if you enjoyed this video. Also, do stick around on the channel to see more content surrounding Baselworld this year and the following few years. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, over and out.